Up next, splitting water with the power of the sun, engaging in mechanized air combat with birds, and how life came to be on planet Earth. All this and more last week. Let's roll.
We are at the beginning of a new wave of research. Our creative powers are being stretched. We're learning surprising things about how we sense the world around us. Exploring the mysteries of the spoken word.
Welcome to the Future Last Week, where we talk about all things awesome and futuristic last week. I'm your host, Wyatt, and it was week 22 of 2022. Just a heads up before we get started, this is going to be a little bit of an experiment. This episode will not be scripted, so we'll have to see how that goes. I'm hoping that everything turns out good, so enjoy. Now, if you've kept up with the news over the last couple years, you've probably heard of hydrogen. And not hydrogen in like the elemental sense, but hydrogen in the put it in your car and drive around kind of sense. The nice thing about hydrogen is that you can store it, you can transport it, and you can burn it as needed. It's kind of like gasoline in that sense. And you know, it's supposed to be the future of energy, right? It's the most abundant thing in the universe. Why shouldn't we tap into it? Well, the problem is that most hydrogen today is what's called gray hydrogen, which is produced through natural gas production. So anybody who wants to use hydrogen in their cars is basically running off of natural gas, which kind of shoots the whole green energy thing in the foot. If you want to be green about it, you can produce hydrogen through electrolysis. And electrolysis is essentially the act of taking two electrodes and sticking them in water. And when you turn on the electricity passing between them ends up splitting the water molecules inside the tank and separating it into H2 and O2. The problem with electrolysis is that it is very energy intensive. And if you know anything about our electric grid, it's that the vast majority of it is either natural gas, coal, or oil plants that produce our electricity. We have nuclear, we have solar, we have wind, but it doesn't make up the majority. Now, if you want to make it green hydrogen, essentially meaning that no carbon is actually produced when you're making this hydrogen through electrolysis, typically you're using wind or solar, and that's great and everything, but the problem is that electrolysis uses quite a lot of power. And so you'd have to put solar panels basically everywhere, which would be a bit tricky and quite expensive. But with this new technology, or rather this new process that they just discovered, you wouldn't need to absorb energy from the sun, convert it to a battery for electricity, and then use the electricity to split the water. You can just use the sun directly, skipping a whole bunch of steps and increasing overall efficiency and cost in order to just split the hydrogen that way. Researchers at the Institute of Materials Chemistry in Vienna, Austria, have made such a discovery, and they've discovered new catalysts that make this possible in the first place. The problem is, and the major reason why we couldn't do this until now, is because they didn't really know what chemicals you could kind of smush together in order to get the expected behavior. Because you can get sunlight to split the water, but the problem is you don't always get out what you want to get out. So instead of getting H2 and O2, you get some other chemical or, whatever else, and that's not really useful if you're trying to make hydrogen if it doesn't spit out hydrogen. This new process is called photocatalytic water splitting, and basically the idea is that on a sheet of light-sensitive material, they place catalysts all over the place, and those catalyst sites are activated by the energy in the sun. It captures water molecules and it splits them up, and then they collect it on the outside of the container or panel or whatever it would happen to be. Now, if we want to get sciencey with it, how does this all work? How is it possible to split water with light? Well, they take small clusters of two different kinds of catalyst, a catalyst that likes to make hydrogen, which happens to be made out of sulfur and molybdenum, a catalyst that likes to make oxygen, which is made out of cobalt, tungsten, and oxygen, and then they anchor them to that light-sensitive plate that I mentioned earlier, which is titanium oxide. What gives the reaction as magic is titanium oxide's reactivity when exposed to light. Essentially, when a photon hits a molecule of titanium oxide, the molecule releases electrons. And the electrons freely move about the surface. And now that the electrons have left the molecules, they themselves become positively charged. The overall effect on the titanium oxide plate is that in many different zones, there's negative and positive charges. These negative and positive charges give the catalysts the energy that they need to actually take the water molecules and rip them apart and split them into hydrogen and oxygen, which then they release and they grab the next water molecule. Essentially, it's just a sun-powered chemical reaction, nothing that fancy about it. The tricky part was just figuring out what those catalysts were supposed to be because, I mean, when you got 112 elements to work with, it's kind of hard to pinpoint exactly what combination of those elements leads to the behavior that you want. So understandably, this took quite a long time. Overall, the system is far more simple than just standard electrolysis because you don't need electrodes, you don't need batteries, and you don't need a power source. You literally just take a tub, you put your titanium oxide layer down, you put down your catalysts, you fill it with water, and you expose it to the sun, and it just produces hydrogen as long as the sun is shining. That being said, this actually makes green hydrogen a lot more practical, because you don't need nearly as much energy. In fact, the only energy you really need is the energy that you put into manufacturing the materials, and then once it's out there, it just makes hydrogen. So you can put it on site, wherever your hydrogen fill-up tanks are, and it will just be producing hydrogen all day long and then releasing the oxygen back into the atmosphere. Or you could capture it and use it to make liquid oxygen or compressed oxygen for hospitals or something. You could even have on-site hydrogen production to save yourself the trip. That's a lot of carbon dioxide that won't be released into the atmosphere when you're transporting it from one area to the next. Or you won't have to create a complicated piping network. You can just make the hydrogen at the pump, and then whoever comes in will have the hydrogen, fill up their car, and drive off, and they don't have to worry about it. And you don't have to use it on just cars either. You can use it on cars and buses and trains and forklifts and trucks and rockets. Especially rockets. Hydrogen is one of the most efficient fuels that you can use for rockets. The problem being is that hydrogen being the smallest element in the universe, it kind of just goes out of whatever tank you put it in. It's literally smaller than the gaps between the molecules that make up the tank, and it will just slowly seep out over time, and there's not really much you can do about it. But all that aside, hydrogen up until now was basically just a weird kind of, I'm not even sure how to put it, a segue technology, I suppose, between burning gasoline and using an electric car. Because then all you have to do is you pull up to the station, you fill up your car, and you drive off, just like a gas station, although technically you're still using electricity. So we'll see. Hydrogen probably has its place in the energy economy, and if that's how it turns out, that's how it turns out. But I look forward to any advancements that they make in the field up until now, because even if it's not really used practically, it's still kind of cool even to read about this stuff. And we might as well use hydrogen in some capacity. It is the most common thing in the universe, so why not? But that's all I got for this story, so we're going to go ahead and move on to story number 2. When you eat a piece of fruit or drink a glass of wine, you probably don't give much thought to where those things actually come from. And, of course, they come from a farm. your apples come from an orchard as well as oranges and tangerines, etc. Your grapes come from vineyards, typically. And farming may seem simple on the surface, but you can't just plant these things and then just get 100% of what you expected to get out of it, because there's a lot of factors that go into how much fruit you can actually send out at the end of the year. You have things like diseases that will either kill the trees or the vines or bugs. In this particular case, we're talking about birds. Birds actually do quite a lot of damage to vineyards, for example. They'll just fly in, take a grape right off the vine, and fly away after eating it. And that's pretty tricky to defend against, and scarecrows don't really do the trick. In the future, there will be automated systems that would protect crops from birds. That would be completely hands-off with no human intervention of any kind. And this is very much a necessary technology too, because farmers lose millions of dollars in damaged or stolen fruit because of just birds alone. That's not even including bugs or anything else. Farmers don't really have access to a low-cost deterrent for crows and other kinds of birds that fly in and eat their crops. Pretty much everything that works really well is very expensive or not practical. To give a few examples of some modern systems that are typically used these days, farmers will actually take their seeds and plant them very, very deep so that the birds can't peck them out of the ground. They'll put in visual decoys like scarecrows, but those don't seem to hardly work ever. If you ever see joke pictures of crows sitting on top of the scarecrows, that should give you an idea. Something I never even knew about before, but they actually use gas cannons, where I guess if there's a lot of birds and they want to scare them all away, they just fire a cannon, I guess, and the loud noise scares them away. They'll have sound devices placed around, and I assume they'd be triggered by sensors of some kind, where they would place predator bird sounds or loud popping noises or something to try to scare away the birds. Bird netting, that's another one. Problem with bird netting is you basically need to put it over the entire field, and that's going to get expensive really, really fast. And that bird netting is also going to make it pretty hard for you to put a tractor through it. The coolest one on the list of systems that I had researched, and I just found out about this as well, there's actually laser systems. They'll come out to the farm and they'll install a post and put a laser on top. And this laser will scan in whatever pattern you want. There's 12 distinct patterns so that the animals don't actually get used to it. So you can do like figure eights or zigzags or whatever it is you want to do. And they'll shine as far as 1,600 yards in the night. And that's pretty cool, because the crows see the laser beam as a solid object that's approaching them, and they freak out and they fly away. Biggest problem is that it's pretty expensive to have these installed. They use quite a lot of electricity, and there's only really been 3,700 that have been installed in the last 8 years over the entire world. The system that I'm going to be talking about today is a little bit more colorful, I guess you would say. It's actually going to be using drones to scare off the crows. They would have cameras placed strategically around the farmland that would scan and basically look for anything that kind of looks like a bird. And if there is something, it'll send a drone that direction. That drone will have its own camera and will be able to determine whether or not what it's looking at is a bird, and it will fly really close to it in the attempt to scare off the bird. It took a lot of years to kind of refine the system with lots of simulated and real testing, because crows, for example, are really, really smart as a 7-year-old child in some studies, apparently. And they actually just realize, oh, that's not a threat. It's just going to fly by me and nothing's going to happen to me. So some of the countermeasures they're going to have to take with this is they're going to be shaping these drones like birds of prey. they'll be fitting speakers to them so that they make those noises, like a hawk or a falcon or whatever. I don't actually know off the top of my head what kind of birds would attack a crow, for example, but that's beside the point. Essentially, you'll have all these little drones flying around these farms that look like hawks and falcons and such, and it spooks the birds off. And you can have them fly in crazy patterns so that the animals don't get used to them. I suppose you could probably even have them collide with the birds to really jostle them off if they refuse to leave. But essentially, the whole system kind of works with those cameras I talked about earlier, and then you would have maybe a depot or a base or whatever you really want to call it, essentially a stand with a charging port on it that the drone would come and land on, charge up, and wait for any commands that are given by the cameras, or they would just constantly patrol and then only come back when they're low on battery, charge up, and then keep patrolling. They would be using pretty much the same drones that they use in package delivery, for example, but like I mentioned earlier, they would look like predatory birds, at least eventually. In the article, it kind of states that this is a low-cost solution. As I read into it a little bit more, it seems like this might actually be more expensive than the lasers themselves, but it's certainly a lot cooler. I mean, you can imagine an armada of drones flying around attacking birds to try to get them out of the field, which, I mean, that sounds pretty comical to me. And I suppose that a distinct advantage over the laser is it probably is overall less electricity, and it has essentially an unlimited range as long as you strategically place your charging ports around your fields. You would probably only need like 5 or 6 drones to cover 100 acres or so, because there's not going to be that many birds. And the mere presence of the drone scaring off the birds all the time is probably going to be enough to deter them from coming back. I mean, I just saw this article and I thought it was kind of nifty that this is something that they're pursuing. Just equipping drones with speakers and masquerading them as birds of prey to try to scare off crows and whatnot. But the thing that makes this mostly the futuristic portion is that the technology, or rather the software that the drones use to detect birds, that's pretty advanced. They've been working on that for a long time. It's pretty hard to identify a bird when your background is nothing but corn. And sure, we can, as humans, we can easily see that, but for a computer to do that, that's pretty impressive, actually. That's pretty much all I have for the second story, so we'll go ahead and move on to the third story. How did life start? I have no idea. That's a question that humanity has probably been asking itself for thousands of years. Not to say that we don't have any guesses, though. There's lots of guesses as to how Earth came to be inhabited by life. Of course, you have the people of the religious persuasion, and then on the secular side of things, we have panspermia, where essentially an asteroid full of life crashed into the Earth and essentially germinated the planet. We also have very interesting theories about aliens bringing us here. And depending on who you ask, that is also an idea of a religious persuasion. The third most likely is that life formed on Earth, all on its own, through a very particular set of circumstances that eventually led to the emergence of life. The right conditions, the right chemicals, the right heat, everything. For the group of people that believe that life developed on Earth, there's pretty much 2 main fields of study in trying to determine what exactly happened. You have the ones who study the incredibly complicated molecules that go into making life work, how it all kind of fits together, the puzzle pieces. The other approach is simply just to say, well, life was probably simpler at one point. It probably used simpler chemicals that are very easily made just through natural processes. And this story is about the latter in this case. 4.35 billion years ago, the Earth was covered in something called basalt lava glass. Essentially just this glass-like substance that was formed through volcanic activity, impacts, and a few other kind of phenomenon that took place on primitive Earth. It turns out that RNA spontaneously forms in basalt lava glass. RNA is basically just half of a DNA molecule, to oversimplify it maybe a little bit. And that's pretty important because, as you know, DNA is the thing in our cells that make us who we are. My DNA is what decides the fact that I have brown hair, I have fingers, I stand upright, I have 10 fingers, 10 toes, I have 2 eyeballs. Pretty much anything like that. The DNA in your cells is the information, the blueprint. And without that, life wouldn't be possible. It has to read something. It has to make proteins, interact with its outside environment. RNA is a DNA molecule cut in half, and it has all the same nucleotides, as they're called, or the little bits of information. When you think of that, you think in, your A's, G's, C's, that kind of stuff. This discovery is essentially asserting that RNA was the very first building block of life. What was required to get life up off its feet? Just a chain of random information. And eventually, one of those chains ended up creating something useful, which turned into life. And then Darwin kind of took it from there. The chemistry to make RNA in this basalt rock is actually pretty simple, surprisingly, despite it being a complicated information-containing molecule. It involves nickel, borax, like the stuff you buy from the store, or as it's chemically known as borate, and the basalt. Now, nucleotides on their own are fairly complicated, and usually don't just spontaneously arise on their own. There is something that's a little bit more simplistic called nucleosides, which can be thought of as almost nucleotides, but they're missing an activated phosphate group. And once added through a very basic chemical reaction, they become nucleotides. So we'll take that information and we'll put it aside for later use. When we turn to the glass, the impacts that actually formed the basalt glass are infused with nickel and iron and such like that, because that basalt glass was formed by meteor strikes, and those meteors had nickel-iron cores. The metals infused with the glass cause a reaction that adds a phosphate group to the nucleosides, turning them into nucleotides. Nucleotides have a tendency to form RNA and DNA once they're finished being made, essentially. They like to stick together because they're different charges. Now, okay, let's kind of review here. We have basalt glass, which is infused with nickel, and we have nucleosides. Maybe I should talk about the nucleosides real quick. That nucleosides are actually just spontaneously formed in the atmosphere at that time because of the hot impacts and the volcanic activity and stuff, and it just happens to be the perfect kind of chemical soup that gives the necessary energy for those nucleosides to form in the atmosphere. Okay, so you have your nucleosides, you put the nucleosides through the basalt rock, kind of percolating through, as it were, or sifting, or whatever word you really want to use for it. Essentially, the nucleosides pass through the basalt rock, and as they pass through, they turn into nucleotides, and when they get to the other side, they're formed into RNA chains. This is such a simple reaction that you can do it in a high school chemistry class, and it will result in RNA. So, okay, now we have RNA. What does that do any good for us? Well, the RNA probably, once it got through the basalt rock, seeped into underground aquifers and probably mixed with oils or something, and there's just that small chance that life sparked at that point. The story doesn't go into much detail about what happens after this point, but I assume it's just a very complicated set of circumstances and then having a molecule that can store information, and it was just luck at that point. One of the reasons why this is so important is because Mars was exactly the same 4.35 billion years ago. Basalt rock everywhere. And the same conditions with water in the atmosphere and vaporized nickel and all sorts of things also would have given rise to nucleosides. That would have eventually turned into life probably, which means that Mars probably had life at one point. Same goes for Venus. Not much different there. That was also probably basalt rocks and whatnot. Although we don't know this for sure because everything we send to Venus vaporizes. The reason we know Mars had these basalt rocks is because, given that there's no tectonic activity on Mars, the rocks are still there. We can look at them on the surface of Mars and we can see that they're of the same composition as what would have been found on Earth 4 billion years ago. This kind of revelation is pretty foundational. It tells us that advanced organic molecules that are necessary for the building of life just spontaneously arise out of fairly basic chemistry. And so that means that life could actually be pretty common in the universe. So maybe we will have something to look forward to when we eventually step outside of our cradle and into the wider galaxy. If you liked this episode, please consider helping the show and telling your friends about it. They get the latest news about our amazing civilization, and I get to enjoy sharing it with them. This show is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. I also have a YouTube channel, if that's how you like to listen. Just search for The Future Last Week and subscribe to the channel. If you'd like to support the podcast, stop by my Patreon or consider becoming a Patreon for some cool benefits, including a shout out in a certain tier. Visit patreon.com/TFLW. Have a good week, and I'll see you next Monday.